Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And thanks to everyone for coming to this. Maggie, Mel, and I have been planning this for a couple months, and we have been so excited. We know that, especially with COVID this year, schools and teachers have been doing so much extra work, so we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come to do this. So we're going to be exploring the concept of gender confidentiality, why it matters, and how all of us can use gender confidentiality to support LGBTQ plus youth. We're also going to have an activity in breakout rooms and work on incorporating this concept into our lives. So I think Maggie's going to take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone. So basically this is just a quick itinerary. We're going to go over some introductions, stuff like that. Just talk about what gender confidentiality is, have some breakout sessions for discussions, and talk about supporting youth in our own lives and our own professional endeavors. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Maggie DeSanza. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a senior at Memorial High School, and I'm the co-president of the Gender Equity Association, along with Melanie and Amira. I'm also the founder of a youth organization based in Wisconsin called Bleed Shamelessly, which works to promote menstrual equity and reproductive justice. If you know me personally, I talk about menstrual equity a lot, so I definitely like talking about reproductive justice, all of that. I'm also a community organizer with the Rape Crisis Center, Planned Parenthood, the Zonta Club of Madison, and the Vote 16 campaign, along with various other endeavors about voter registration and getting youth voices out there in terms of politics. Also, I really like to read. I like to public speak. I'm on the forensics team. I'm a writer, and I also really like to horseback ride. So that's a bit about me.
Sorry, I'm not the most technologically savvy, but I am going to be working the presentation the rest of the night. So my name is Melanie Golden. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm also a senior at Memorial High School. I'm the co-president, like Maggie and Amira. I'm a member of the Social Justice Book Club, along with the co-vice president of Spartan Awareness and a member of the Spanish Honor Society. And I'm interested in the continued protection and support of LGBTQ plus rights. And also, if you know me personally, I'm a pretty avid swimmer. I'm one of the captains for the swim team. And yeah, those are kind of my favorite things.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amira Parati. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I'm a junior at Memorial High School and also one of the co-presidents of the Gender Equity Association. This summer, I had the absolute honor to participate in the 2020 ACLU National Advocacy Institute. I'm an organizer with Bleed Shamelessly, and I'm one of the student facilitators of the Game Changers programs at the Rape Crisis Center. I love reading and making metalwork and glasswork.
Awesome. So before we go in depth about what gender confidentiality is and have some of those really complex discussions, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Gender Equity Association and what Melanie, Amira, and I do at Memorial High School. So basically, we are all the co-presidents of the JMM High School Gender Equity Association, which is an active organization at Memorial that discusses women's issues, feminism, LGBTQ plus liberation, restorative justice, politics, and general community grassroots activism. In the past couple of years, we have done a ton of projects and hosted a bunch of discussions ranging from global feminism and working to sponsor women and girls' education outside of the United States, presented at various advocacy conferences, hosted a clothing drive to promote sustainable fashion, raised money for domestic abuse victims, and we even received a $1,500 grant for our work from the Tegan and Sarah Foundation. So we have done a ton of work for promoting LGBTQ plus justice, feminism, and general political equity. And if you have any questions, want to get involved, help organize, or in general contribute to the efforts of the Gender Equity Association, please feel free to reach out to jmgenderequity@gmail.com. We also sent you an email with the link to the call and everything. So it should be in your recent inbox, but just wanted to give that resource to anyone if you're interested.
So kind of the main thing that everyone's here for today, the discussion of gender confidentiality. So gender confidentiality is the practice of not divulging a person's gender identity to anyone, including parents, guardians, other school staff, anyone that an individual might not know personally or that you know they have informed said person of their gender identity. And obviously that should be only given at an individual's request. So in a school setting, gender confidentiality allows students who are non-binary, transgender, or gender expansive to have access to an inclusive and unprejudiced environment. By keeping their own gender identity to themselves or sharing it with those who they feel comfortable, it helps create an equitable environment for them.
Yeah, so now we're going to get into why gender confidentiality is important. For those of you who are new to this topic, and that was a very long definition, no worries, we're going to get into some examples too. Basically, gender confidentiality in its simplest form is not outing trans, non-binary, and gender expansive youth. And while this seems very simple, in practice it can get complicated, especially if a minor is living with unsupportive families, and which is why this statistic is especially important. If a student is outed to their families, they might be sent to conversion therapy, which is basically an overnight camp of sorts where they are taught that being trans, being non-binary, gender expansive, or any other part of the LGBTQ plus community is a choice, that it oftentimes this is in connection to a certain religion, and oftentimes they're told then that being LGBTQ plus is sinful. And studies have shown that conversion therapy can have major mental health impacts for LGBTQ plus people, especially LGBTQ plus youth. Sadly, 57% of trans and non-binary youth who have undergone conversion therapy have attempted suicide. This was a study done by the Trevor Project in 2019. They are working to lower suicide rates of trans, non-binary, and gender expansive youth. The sad part is that even if families do not send their kid to conversion therapy, there can also be other negative impacts of outing a student to their families, as Melanie, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. One of the other main impacts of outing a student to unsupportive families is that students may be forced to leave their home, they may be kicked out, and for minors, this places them in a really awful situation, many of whom may not have enough funds to get their own apartment or find safe housing. For trans and non-binary people who are homeless, a study from 2015 called the US Transgender Survey found that 26% of all homeless respondents avoided shelters because of fear of anti-trans abuse. Another 4% of respondents who were homeless were turned away because they were trans. And of those who did stay in shelters, 70% were abused. These numbers increased significantly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color because of the terrible negative stereotypes around BIPOC trans people.
Yeah, so Mel, if you could go to the next slide. Basically, gender confidentiality is incredibly important in school settings as well. In fact, this is where a lot of our examples will revolve around today, since a great deal of the people here are educators or people involved in a school setting. So basically, according to a study by GLSEN performed in 2018, 59% of transgender students have been denied access to a restroom consistent with their gender identity, and 75% of transgender students feel unsafe at school. So this directly plays and displays how deeply transphobic our educational institutions are. making coming out for transgender and non-binary students all the more difficult, meaning that it is incredibly important for them to do it at their own choices. In many cases, if students were outed by a teacher, administrator, or staff to their parents or family or guardians, they would be met with direct cases of discrimination. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that these cases of discrimination are all too common. So 59% of transgender students have been denied access to a restroom consistent with their gender identity. So these are not inconsistent or unusual happenings and occurrences. In fact, if we go to the next slide, Melanie, the CDC has reported that of transgender students in school, 10% were threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. 34% were bullied on school property, and 28% were bullied electronically. So the violent extent of these horrific realities show us that when students are outed before they are emotionally, physiologically, and mentally, or even physically ready for themselves, they are no longer in control of their education, and they can't effectively learn or contribute to a classroom environment. So being met with physical and psychological violence, it discourages students from attending school, actively engaging in their classes, and legitimately having an effective and long-lasting education.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share some other real life examples. Not all, obviously, some of these don't exactly take place in school environments, but they're very relevant in the discussion of gender confidentiality. In Las Vegas, Bradley Roberts, a transgender school police officer, was told that he was not allowed to use either restroom. And since his gender identity was publicly known, it can be assumed that he faced discrimination because of that, and that is why he was no longer told to use why he was told to no longer use the restrooms at the school. Similarly, in Georgia, Jennifer Chavez was let go from her job at Credit Nation Auto Sales, and because she was transgender. Although the courts didn't rule in her favor, she knew that it was because of her gender identity and that it was the main reasoning behind her loss of her job. And so in summary, gender confidentiality can protect people from verbal and physical abuse. Like has been spoken about before, there's been a history of people that are out that are gender expansive, transgender, or non-binary that have faced serious repercussions just from the way that they feel. And so LGBTQ plus youth that choose to be out at school but are not at home may live with homophobic or transphobic parents, and they can be kicked out of their homes or overall just abused by their parents. This can lead them to struggling with mental health like anxiety or depression, and by allowing gender confidentiality, this creates a precedent of listening to LGBTQ plus people's needs.
Yeah, it's also important to note that there are exceptions to gender confidentiality. The main part is if an individual has asked for a friend, a family member, or other parts of their community to not share their gender identity, but are a risk themselves or others, need health services, and are unwilling to go because of whatever reason, then gender confidentiality can and should be broken. The physical and mental well-being of the individual does come in priority. And also when thinking about in schools, we've had conversations with teachers who were concerned that gender confidentiality was asking for for teachers not to out students to families, even when there was a concern over physical or mental safety, which is not the case. Teachers can be a fantastic resources for families and letting them know when they are concerned with a student's health and safety, and gender confidentiality should not come in front of this in any way. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically now that we understand a little bit about gender confidentiality, we're going to start talking about actually protecting students' rights to gender confidentiality and kind of the nuances, just like Amira was just explaining, the nuances of what creates a safe space, whether or not there are exceptions, and how we can apply it to all of our lives and all of our experiences in the workplace and in the classroom. So we are going to put you all in randomized breakout rooms, and once you're there, we'd really encourage you to share your name, pronouns, if you want to, a fun fact about yourself, if you're comfortable, just to kind of get to know the other 3 or 4 people in your breakout room. And then we would like you to discuss the following questions that we will put in the chat once you are in your breakout rooms. Otherwise, feel free to take a screenshot of the questions that Melanie has on the screen here for us. But otherwise, we will put them in the chat. The first question, we'll go over them a little bit to kind of make any clarifying connections. What do you define as a safe space? Interpret this question in any way that you would like to, applicable to any student demographic that you originally associate it with, or any location or setting that you associate it with. We really want to hear your thoughts, what you immediately think of when you think of a safe space. And then moving on from there, how can we actually create safe spaces? How can straight, cisgender, and non-intersex people support the LGBTQ plus community? So moving it forward to LGBTQ plus people. Next, how can adults work to respect youth autonomy in general? So this could be associated with LGBTQ plus rights, or it could be associated with any other situations that you all may have experienced in the classroom or in an educational setting. And then finally, we want you to apply these principles to your school, work, and home environment, how you can make it more of a safe space, knowing that we should now keep gender confidentiality in mind. Get through as many of these as you can in about 10 to 15 minutes. I know that there are a lot of questions, and Melanie, Amira, and I could talk about like question number 1 for about 3 hours. So we understand that they are very loaded. So take as much time as you need to kind of go through each question. And if you don't get to all of them, that's totally fine. When we all come back together at the end, we will, of course, give you a warning as to how much time you have left. And then we would just ask if some of you feel comfortable sharing either in the chat or unmuting yourself and sharing what you all thought to these questions. And then towards the end, Melanie, Amira, and I will share our thoughts and kind of how we make sense of these questions and relate them back to gender confidentiality. So we just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to kind of share what they heard or what they said, or any, interesting things that you all might have thought about in regards to the questions. If you want to unmute yourself and share it with us, that would be excellent as well. If you'd like to say it into the chat, that would be excellent as well. So yeah, go ahead and does anyone want to answer the first question? What do you define as a safe space? Anything that they heard, anything that they thought of?
One question that came up in our group was many of us who are working in a virtual format, of course, because when we were in a physical space, you can have identifiers on your door, you can, it seems easier. So what are some ways that we could create a safe space in a virtual format that helps reinforce all these ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. We know that virtual schooling, I think a lot of people in this are doing virtual schooling, and it's a lot more challenging to kind of communicate your support for marginalized students in your classrooms. One thing that first came to mind was Google Classrooms, Bitmoji classrooms. A lot of teachers have had like signs that have like LGBTQ plus posters or Black Lives Matter posters on their walls, which is great. But even going deeper than that, deeper than a sign on your wall or a sticker on your door that says that you are an ally to the LGBTQ plus community or any student demographic. It's important to think about how we can constantly think about supporting and being co-conspirators to marginalized students in the classrooms beyond the more superficial ways that we kind of have gone about it in the past. Not saying that having posters of support isn't valuable and isn't important, because it definitely makes students feel more comfortable, but also we can incorporate LGBTQ plus curriculum into any content that you have, no matter what subject you're teaching, using it as an example, especially in social sciences classes. Yes, inclusive language, sending the right signals, asking for pronouns, and Melanie and Amira are going to go more in depth specifically about how we can create more generally safer classrooms and more gender confidential classrooms. But generally, I think that we have to think about it in a more holistic way. Making sure that when we're thinking of safe space, we're not just thinking of a physical location, we're thinking of a mentality, a group mentality that people have, understanding that when you have open discussions, some people are going to be, you want people to say things, and you want people to ask questions, and understanding that people are going to say something that could offend another person, and not making that seem as though we should ostracize someone for being interested or asking a question, but rather we should grow from those questions, correct them, explain why that might be offensive or hurtful to someone or a community, and kind of redirect that statement and make it so that it is inclusive while still thought-provoking and still asking the same questions. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Oh yeah, sorry.
Quickly add on. One other thing that I think is really important is knowing what is, making sure that you're approachable. I know in one of my classes, I am with a student who in the past has said that he will not use trans person's correct pronouns, and as a trans person and seeing him on the class list, I was very wary, but I know the teacher in that class, and I know if anything happens, I can be like, look, this occurred, this is what I need from you, this is what I need to happen. And I think that's really important, because even though we are not in the same place, if there's a chat function on Zoom or other online abuse that can be on social media outside the classroom, knowing that, having students know that they can come to you and share, and that you will listen and then take action. I think that's really important, to having students feel safe and comfortable. And that's a hard thing to manage, especially if students are sending private chats. So always letting students know that they can email you at any time if something occurs. I think that's really important. Also, I just want to highlight something that Gretchen Forbes mentioned in the chat, that her group talked about the difficulty of evaluating one's own space and attempting to make a safe space, but you may have missed it. Firstly, great to see you again, Ms. Forbes. And I think one quick note on that is letting students know that you want to learn, that you want to grow, and that you know that you are going to miss things. Some of the most productive relationships I've had with teachers in some of my health classes, where I asked to see some of the LGBTQ plus curriculum, and they were like, look, it's not as great as where we wanted. And then so I gave them some pointers on that, and we were able to make a better presentation, and that was more inclusive, and that helped students feel more at home in a topic that is very much binary in regards to talking about gender and sex, which can be alienating. So those are just some thoughts. And if anyone has anything else to add, or anything else to talk about the next question, how we can create safe spaces, we'd love to hear it.
I was going to say, I think I saw Emery raise their hand. So Emery, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm just never sure what the standards are about just unmuting or being respectful. But our group talked a lot about, in creating a safe space, how important it is to really explicitly define what that means to you and to the students you're working with, and kind of the caveat that having that triangle or that flag on your door doesn't necessarily mean anything if you don't back it up with words and actions. And so we talked specifically about having really clear class agreements about things like confidentiality and understanding kind of what topics can be addressed in a particular space. And then also kind of the job of us as adults to follow through with those expectations that we set with our words and our actions, and to model that for young people that we're working with.
Absolutely. That is an incredibly important thing to say. And just tying it back to what Gretchen had earlier mentioned in the chat, it's really important that we not only define what safe means to ourselves as educators, as students, etc., but what it means to other people in the room, and how we can respect our own boundaries while making sure that we are also respecting other people's boundaries and needs. So yeah, that is an excellent point. Any other thoughts on that? I love that people are writing things in the chat. I love that. Okay, if there's nothing else on that, and we can also certainly revisit things. But here's a more general question, relating it more back to LGBTQ plus people. How can straight, cisgender, non-intersex people support LGBTQ plus people? Yeah, this is kind of a loaded question. If you want to apply it to things outside of the classroom, go ahead. But it is very open-ended, so yeah.
One of the things that our group talked about is being open to like criticism or being open to having things pointed out, because no member of the LGBT community can speak for every member of the LGBT community, and really they can speak to their specific experiences. And so recognizing that, like me, I might be able to help LGBT students more and be like more aware of the issues that they face than I might be aware of the experiences that trans people face. And recognizing that like my gayness is not a shield to like being discriminatory, and is not a shield to being unaware of things, is really important. So like and like explicitly telling their students, being like, there are some things that I'm much more knowledgeable in than others, but I'm willing to hear anything. And so if I have an experience that's different than yours, don't hesitate to like tell me what you need from me in that regard. So I think that was something that our group touched on that was really important.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you for bringing that up. I would like to also add on and say, especially when we're talking about the intersections of different identities, there are a lot of LGBTQ plus people who are white often talk over Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks who are also LGBTQ plus. This is a huge problem of racism in the LGBTQ plus community, and being aware of how different identities, whether it be class, disability, gender, and anything else, how that intersects is really important. If there are any other thoughts or things that people would like to share, we'd love to hear them.
One thing that I'd like to add to the conversation is that it's really important to understand, just going off of Amira, that our privileges, especially in this context as straight, cis people or non-intersex people, view our entire, or shape rather, our entire view of the world. So my experience as a cis person definitely impacts the way that I perceive trans people, and also the power dynamic, the inherent power dynamic that exists in that relationship. And it doesn't mean that I overtly dislike trans people by any means, but it does mean that I inherently have those biases, but beyond that, I inherently have that power dynamic and the power over trans people just as a cis person. So before even applying it to people that you're interacting with, you need to apply it to yourself. And really, and this isn't like an attack to people, this is just calling out people on recognizing their privileges, be it straight, cis, white, socioeconomic, etc., to really challenge those ideas, do some unlearning, and stop necessarily automatically associating yourself as an ally. I support the LGBTQ plus community, therefore I am not homophobic. Therefore I am not transphobic. That can be a really dangerous way of thinking about it. We really have to back all of those thoughts up with actions. Otherwise, we cannot claim to be allies. Yes. Awesome. So moving on, this is another interesting question. How can adults work to respect youth autonomy? This is something that really fascinates me as a youth organizer. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
We kind of talked about that in the context of creating safe spaces and allyship as well, and kind of addressing Ms. Forbes' comment earlier about how to evaluate safe space, that it is something that has to be designated by the youth, and similarly to how we don't want to claim the title of ally and cheerio, I'm off, I'm good, that it's our responsibility to prove to those people that we want to be safe for, that we are safe, and that they get to bestow that designation on us. And so we really emphasize that listening and that being willingness to be called out and be corrected as ways that adults can support young people. And also, I think for adults, for us to just shut up sometimes and let young folks talk, because y'all usually know better anyway.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that comment. I really appreciate that. I think that this applies to any power dynamic, but in the context of young people, I think it's really important, especially in an educational setting, that we not only make way for students to speak, but also uplift their voices and use our resources and our privileges as, administrators, educators, etc. Even though I understand that sometimes it feels that you have very little power in the school community, you have more power than students do ultimately. At least in an administrational sense. So uplifting those voices and bringing them to the forefront of conversations through advocating for what students are saying at school board meetings, or making sure that you take what they say into accountability when it comes to curriculum, what language you're using in the classroom, anything like that. So I really value that point.
I just wanted to say I agree a lot with Emery and what you're saying, Maggie. I think that we need more workshops like these that are led and facilitated by young people, such as the three of you. I think it is so imperative to making real change. And I think just to echo a lot of what you said, it's just important to, as an educator, kind of take more of a listening role and lift the voices of young people themselves. I think that is unfortunately something that's more new or that hasn't always been done in the past. And I think that's a big reason why meaningful change hasn't happened in some of these systems. So again, just to say, I appreciate this space, these conversations, and that it is facilitated by the three of you. I think is just amazing and important.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And we appreciate all of you for joining. We do want to give some time for Melanie and Amira in the last few slides just to talk a little bit about tangible things that you all can do. But if there's time afterwards and we want to be respectful of all of your time as well. So if there's time afterwards that you guys would like to stay and talk about the last question, we can totally do that. But otherwise, I think I'm going to let Melanie and Amira take it to the next slide.
Yeah. So I also kind of wanted to mention this briefly, but also, make sure that if you need to leave at 5 o'clock, we completely understand. Just feel free to do what you want or what is appropriate for you. We are going to be, since we are recording this session, we'll probably post your recording and it'll be pretty easily accessible. So one of the things that kind of relates to that last question that we didn't quite get to is how to support gender confidentiality. This combines also the workplace as well as a school environment and just your general practice in your life, is making sure not to out people. Coming out is an incredibly personal experience and people should be able to do it at their own speed in any way that they want, and that's their own personal decision. Also knowing your boundaries. If someone comes out to you, ask when, where, and how you should refer to them, just making sure that you are respecting their pronouns, the name that they'd like you to refer to them as, and everything similar to that. And also making sure to educate yourself. There's quite a few things happening in the mass media right now, and also just in terms of cases and landmark cases and things like that, and just making sure that you're aware of what you're doing as a person and also what's happening in the world around us, and creating that safe space that we talked about. There's kind of a reason why we highlighted that, is that like we want to make sure that everyone has an appropriate environment that they feel comfortable being at, and advocating for gender confidentiality policies. At least for us, we're pretty heavily behind gender confidentiality. Obviously, we're leading a workshop about it. So kind of making sure that you're aware of that, and also vote for people who support the LGBTQ plus community, and making sure that like you're voting and you're supporting people who support the views that you have and the values that you care about. So, yeah. And so kind of on a broader, or on a more workplace scale, making sure that you're sharing your pronouns and relevant gender information at the beginning of meetings. Some people, you have to respect also that some people might not feel comfortable sharing their gender identity or other relevant gender information to others, even though they might feel comfortable sharing that with you, and making sure that you're kind of instilling this idea that people need to normalize knowing other people's pronouns and referring to them as such. Keeping up to date on gender identity laws and statutes, and advocating on an administrational level for peers and colleagues. That can be a pretty major factor for a lot of gender expansive, non-binary, trans people, and also in general LGBTQ plus people. In order to create a safe environment for them, it can help if you're personally advocating for them and creating an environment that they feel comfortable in.
Yeah, so here are just some quick points on gender confidentiality in more of in a less formal setting, such as with a friend, or if you are an educator with a student. As Melanie said, always educate yourself. There's always more to learn. Ideas about gender and the best practices are always updating. So keeping an eye out for new practices, best practices is always a great idea. Also, ask questions. Each trans, non-binary, and gender expansive person has a different idea or different needs, different wants. So making sure that you know what their individual needs and wants and asks are is very important. Giving advice for how to conduct interactions as a trans, non-binary, gender expansive person, giving that advice might feel alienating, especially if you are a cis person. That can seem patronizing in some ways, even if it's meant to help out. A great way from my own experience with talking with other LGBTQ plus folks is if they say, hey, this is something I've been struggling with, that's a segue to be like, I saw this thing, or I have a friend who did this and it was helpful. Also, if you have news clippings or things that made you smile and that was about the LGBTQ plus community, you want to share those, and sending those along can both, for some folks, it can seem welcoming, showing that you are there for them, but it can also seem like tokenization. So writing a note saying no need to respond to this can help folks feel welcome and inclusive and know that you are keeping them, their needs in mind. Keeping information confidential, as always, number one, important. This might be different for different people. They may be fine with you sharing pronouns, but not their gender identity, for example. Validation is key. Express support, express love. It always feels good to have someone say that you look fantastic, you are carrying yourself with poise, or whatever it is. Just saying, hey, I saw this cute clip and I thought of you, or just say, you know, I really appreciate you as a friend or someone in my life. Also, be patient. It may take a while for anything, any part of the coming out process, any part of gender confidentiality, so being aware of that.
Yeah, so we just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. you can unmute yourself, or of course, if you have to leave, we want to respect people's times. I almost said 6 o'clock. I'm in Eastern time right now, but 5 o'clock Central. Then please go ahead and email jmmgenderequity@gmail.com, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. We've already had a few questions over email, so we'll be happy to answer those in depth over email. Also, feel free to look back on the recording that we'll be releasing of this. But does anyone have any questions? You can type them in the chat or unmute yourself.
I do have a question. And Melanie, you brought up that you were part of the swim team, and I'm the head coach for the girls track team. But what's happening with our team more and more is we're having a lot of gender neutral athletes compete with us, and we're trying to create an open environment where we've always divided the teams and there's gender language for Title IX equity purposes. So I guess my question to you from a student perspective, and Melanie, I'd really be interested to hear as an athlete here on a team, what could we do as coaches to offer supporting spaces or safe spaces? And I'm even thinking of like how we introduce meetings, announce them at school, and how people feel access points to getting to the team. I think once students have gotten there, they felt pretty comfortable talking with us, and I hope they felt supported. Because we do, we across the spectrum, we allow students to kind of select where they want to practice, but competition becomes a different thing. And that's a little bit out of our control. I've been working with Mr. Schlitz on some of that and the language being used around that and where the WIA is at. But any advice that you might have on engaging students in something that's an extracurricular, and I think is an important part of people identifying as being a Spartan and feeling like a student. So any advice would be great.
Yeah. I agree with you that there are a lot of like kind of specific rules that the WIA has regarding, like, at least for swimming, I know that there's even language that like you can't have a like person who is of like the female sex in the same pool as someone who is of the male sex. And I think there's a lot of like kind of overarching issue within that and of itself. But I think in terms of like on a more personal, local level, creating that environment where you share your pronouns, you also don't ostracize people for maybe being non-binary or gender expansive or trans, and making sure that you're kind of keeping them in the loop as if you would other students, and also just kind of making sure that you are clear with your environment and like that you're creating a safe space for that environment. And I think that truly, like, at least for me, I know that I would feel comfortable speaking with my coach about anything, and I think that kind of fostering that environment can create a completely different experience for someone who's non-binary, gender expansive, or trans. And at least I also know that there have been situations where people might use she, her, hers, and they, them pronouns, at least for us on the team, and just kind of making sure that you are really clear with how you also expect your other athletes to behave with them as well. And I think that I kind of to what Amira alluded to with a student that she had mentioned that was unwilling to use trans students' pronouns or their chosen names and everything like that. Like, it's hard to completely control every single person, as you probably know. The bigger the team, the harder it is. And so just kind of making sure that you're aware of what's happening, that anyone would feel comfortable coming to you with any questions that they had, or just sharing anything about their gender identity, or even if they felt comfortable saying something like, hey, so-and-so was saying something that was offensive, and just kind of sharing that and making sure that you're enforcing this idea that that environment is a required aspect for your team. So it's my piece.
I would like to quickly add on to that. Firstly, that's a fantastic question. And as a non-binary student at Memorial, I honestly did not know that non-binary and gender expansive people were allowed to join any gendered sports teams until a couple months ago. I am not interested in sports, but there is just a disconnect. And district-wide, the practice is this information is available upon request, but there isn't any advertising. I also know that for me at least, I do not feel comfortable being in any spaces where I would be gendered as either. So even saying that I'm on the girls' track team or swim team, that would cause a lot of gender dysphoria for me. So even thinking of how Memorial and other teams might be able to change this language. So instead of the girls team, maybe it's girls and non-binary, girls and gender expansive, and you do that for both. That way, when people want to join a team, then they know that this is an option. I think also it would demonstrate that these spaces are inclusive and are to be safe spaces. So it is a bigger conversation, and it does mean that I know that there will be a lot of parents who would be very concerned knowing that their child is competing with trans students, but I don't know. Those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, and thank you, Amira, because what's helpful, I think, is on that kind of that PR marketing end from our end, because I do think we have some control over that in the language that we use. I think the competition part gets tricky because there's regulations, and this goes all the way to the IAAF, which is the international, and Caster Semenya, if you're familiar with, is sort of being banned from competing in the female side of track and field because she measures for too much testosterone naturally. So this is a huge debate that's going on, but I like the idea of adding that language into our forums or our meetings and making sure people know that it's inclusive and marketing that way.
Yeah, I also like that you brought up Caster Semenya and like the fact that she's intersex and she can't run, even though she is one of the best athletes out there. I also think that even sharing that information outright, saying that these are what we have to do legally to like compete. But even if there's a way for if a trans student is not able to compete with, say, the girls team in competitions, but is allowed to, during practice, join the girls team, and making sure that information is out there. So when students are reading through this information, they're like, oh, there's a way for me to still participate without gender dysphoria or as much harassment as there might have been otherwise.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I'm not involved in athletics at Memorial or in general, so I'm glad that Melanie and Amira took that one. Any other questions or things that people want to add?
I guess, could I just ask, so I know there's still some Memorial specific people here. If you could tell teachers at Memorial to like either stop doing this one thing or start doing this one thing, is there something that kind of just pops into your head of like, and please don't name names, but I'm sure that you've had some really great experiences and some probably not so great experiences. So any like definite do or don't that you would change?
That's an excellent question. And of course we wouldn't name names. Yes, even though I'm thinking of some. I think that the biggest thing for me has been tokenization. And I think that this plays out in so many different ways. For me, it's translated to tokenization as like a gay woman. For I'm sure other people, it's been related to their race, it's been related to their gender identity, etc. So I think that one example of tokenization that I have seen in a classroom is teachers directly calling out students and asking how they feel or experience as insert identity here. And I think that and sharing it in front of the class, that is outlandishly disrespectful and a violation of their confidentiality and their right to come out, etc. Or to identify as whatever identity that they do have. So I think that, there are plenty of more examples, but for the sake of time, tokenization in general is certainly something that frustrates me. I don't know, Melanie or Amira, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I personally, I know that like kind of pronouns have become a much more relevant thing this year more than others, at least in my experience. That's one thing that I really think that teachers should be pushing, and I'm really grateful when people mention that like you should have your pronouns attached to your name on Zoom, because someone might forget how you identify, and making sure that you're creating that environment where you're requiring people to understand other people's pronouns is really important. So I've been appreciating that, but I agree with Maggie though with the tokenization. I've heard more than a couple stories about that. So
Yeah, I would like to quickly add on about the tokenization. One thing which some of my teachers have done, which is fantastic, is like just the other day, right after Rosh Hashanah, one of my teachers was like, hey, does anyone want to explain what this holiday is, what it means? And I'm Jewish, and I had mentioned it in like the getting to know you thing. And she said, if you want to share, if you're Jewish, if you're not Jewish, I'm not Jewish, but I feel comfortable explaining it if you don't feel like talking right now. And that was really fantastic. And it allows students to pick and choose. There are times where I'm great talking about everything Judaism. There are times where I'm like, I'm not feeling like it today. Another thing which memorial specific, which I would like to see more inclusion, is in language classes presenting gender neutral pronoun options. When last year I came out as non-binary, and I had no idea even if there were any gender neutral pronouns in Spanish. And I honestly had no idea. So I had to do a lot of research on my own, which was very difficult because everything around it was in Spanish. There wasn't like any quick Wikipedia page. I also didn't know if the teachers would accept me using a gender neutral pronoun, because for how many years now, all they've talked about is how it's ella or el, and so that was alienating. So presenting these options from the first class, here are different pronouns, here are conjugations for when talking about descriptors and that kind of thing, I think should be and can be included.
Can I just say thank you so much? As the French teacher, I already filled out my little form. And I was like, that's the first thing I need to do. I've been sitting on this lesson because it's a topic that honestly, I didn't know a whole lot about. I lived in France for years. I didn't, have a lot of interactions with people. And I think that things have progressed. And I just learned there are 3 gender neutral pronouns in French that you can choose from. And just being comfortable with that uncomfortableness. And I was kind of waiting to push this lesson out because I wanted to know my kids a little better. And I think you're totally right. I was wrong. This is like day one kind of stuff. And it is hard when a language is so gender based, like a chair is a girl, a table is a girl, but the pen is masculine, So I just want to say thank you guys so much. And I promise your language teachers support and love you. So.
Thank you so much, Mademoiselle Sparks. Yeah, I'm sorry, I take Spanish. But any other questions or anything? Also, I want to quick remind people, Brian just sent a link to a Google form in the chat, which is just a feedback form telling us how we did today and anything that you'd like to see in future, things just like that. And it would really help us kind of, evolve for future workshops and stuff like that. So if you have some time to fill that out, that'd be very helpful. Any other questions or anything like that?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, as a teacher, thinking about usually one of the first days sort of activities, I have done activities where it's like, what are your name and your pronouns? And one of the things that I've thought about a lot with that activity is that while I want, and not necessarily, I've moved away from sharing them with the class, that it's just starting with share them with me on a form, just starting with me, so that no one has to feel like they out themselves to the entire class on day one if they're not in a place where they can do that, they feel comfortable doing that yet. But I guess it's also thinking about students' experiences around school and the amount of LGBTQIA plus students feeling uncomfortable in school, that in a way I'm an extension of school, and that discomfort towards school could still be felt towards me. And what would you recommend as something I can do just kind of from the get-go? Because in my mind, I go at it with not necessarily expecting anyone to see me as somebody they can feel comfortable outing their gender or sexuality to. But I want to make sure that that's something I validate in class as best I can on their terms. So what could I do from the beginning to kind of like present it in a way that that students might be comfortable sharing that with me, kind of from the beginning?
Yeah, I actually think saying what you just said would be perfect. One thing is I've been in interactions where teachers are like, I am an ally, and so you should feel safe to do X, Y, Z. And I'm like, great, but what if I don't feel that? So recognizing and validating those feelings, I think, is the most important part. So saying that and understanding that that might change, that it may be a couple weeks, a half a year, the entire year, until folks are comfortable with that, and letting them know that you feel okay with that. One of the things which I felt like are awkward, especially like with my family, is that, oh, you should feel comfortable because I love you, or, I'm your friend or whatever. And that makes me really uncomfortable, because it can be really hard even to come out to someone who you trust. It took me months to come out to my entire family, and I had a couple panic attacks about it, even though I knew that they were all going to be supportive. So I think just recognizing the complexity of all of that is important, and will help students realize, all right, it's okay, and I don't have to, and they're not going to guilt me into anything or something like that.
Yeah, I totally love that you brought this up, because I think that this is a really important question. And just like adding on to what Amira said, I think that one thing that we at least have experienced in being like the leaders of the Gender Equity Association is that oftentimes students who aren't out to their family or peers yet, they can come to the Gender Equity Association, a space where we make sure that only on certain days are mandated reporters or teachers there, and that it is a place for people to openly speak with people who have common ideology and mutual respect for one another, that they can come share their experiences and understand that they can say whatever they want to say, to share whatever they want to say, and without being judged for it. And I think that maybe in your classroom, sending students to student groups that GSAs, Gender Equity Associations, Black student unions, et cetera, I'm sure that there are plenty of groups at your school, and if not, you can help students start some of their own groups in validating other students' experiences. But really having like a tight-knit group of students, a group where they can go and know that they won't feel judged, is really valuable. Just the other day, I heard from one of our members that he felt so safe in the Gender Equity Association that he decided to write a college application about how the space was. So it can really be crucial in creating a space where students feel like somewhere at school they have a voice and they have a space where they can be themselves.
Just to do a quick plug, sorry, this is like an accidental plug, but the three of us run an Instagram account mainly headed by Amira called LGBTQ Kids Plus Quarantine, or like LGBTQ Kids Quarantine. Sorry, I'm butchering this username right now. I'm going to write it in the chat in a second. But there's a lot of valuable information in there, including like how to start a GSA at your school, uplifting students just in general, virtual learning with students. Just if you're looking for another resource that like youth have made, specifically us, feel free to check that out as well. Thank you, Amira.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? I know it's like it's 5:20, so yeah. If people have to go, that's fine. But thank you for staying overtime. That's great. To ask your questions and to just engage with us. And just one more time, if you guys would like to fill out the feedback form, I can like copy and paste it in the chat. But that would be super, super helpful for us. Oh, thank you, Brian. So yeah. Any other questions, last things? Okay, excellent. Well, thank you all again so much for coming. Have a great rest of your evening. And yeah, have fun creating safe spaces in your workplace. Yay!
Have a nice night.